Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for coming out. It's great to see so many people here today. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The Vandals are in the grid. They're in every debate, and luckily I don't need to be an expert in nuclear power to be way ahead of where our national debate is, because we're still back at the only nation on earth that 30 years ago still debating whether we should even have a discussion on nuclear. Because yes, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I used to believe in global warming. I was a green and I thought I was helping. But we're in an era of pagan witchcraft pretending to be science. So I have bad news. Our national infrastructure has been captured by Neolithic sorcery. It really is that bad. And so 5,000 years ago, tribal shaman used to say, I can stop the storms, give me your goats and your girls, and I will make the weather good. And what's changed? They wear lab coats now, and they're still saying the same thing. I can stop the storms, I can make the weather nice. Just think for a minute how many things they say they can control. Global warming not only warms the earth, but it causes floods and droughts, and it causes downpours and frost. You didn't know that it increased frost, but actually it has in Australia. It increases cyclones apparently, except we don't see that in the data, and makes rain bombs. It also increases hay fever. Flesh-eating bacteria will be more prolific. This is the 4 plagues and the horsemen and everything. It makes fish reckless. That's right, they've done those studies. Personality changes in fish, it increases the growth of brain-destroying amoeba. I mean, you can't make a B-grade movie this bad, and this is our national policy. It shrinks humans, global warming, and it will give us plagues of jellyfish, which strangely correlate with solar cycles better than they correlate with CO2, but don't mention that, of course. It causes, and literally, seriously, in the last month, they've said volcanoes and earthquakes will be increased because, you know, as you melt the ice off the poles, the crustal plates will shift. So volcanoes, earthquakes, that's all caused by your air conditioner. And you drive the wrong car and you eat the wrong steak. You know these things. It slows, even lately, it slows the rotation of the earth. So you thought this debate couldn't get more silly, but they keep coming up with stuff. So you think about where we're at in this debate, and they're telling us to put solar panels on because it will hold back the tide, because it will stop the floods in Bangladesh, because it will stop bushfires. You thought getting rid of the fuel load might stop bushfires, but instead you needed to put solar panels on your roof, really. I mean, it's that crazy, but we're spending billions of dollars. Yes. Yes, if you want to save the koalas, get a Tesla Powerwall. When I say sorcery and Neolithic witchcraft, you can see where I'm coming from. So they've turned scientists into witch doctors because the government captured science. And the more money government spends on science, the worse it gets. Yes, and the latest thing, yes, will the beefsteaks really change the rotation of the earth? Do you know that? If you eat beef, of course, that's our increase of CO2. Increasing the CO2 changes, melts the poles, the water shifts to the edge of the earth on the equator, and therefore it slows the rotation of the earth. Yes, eat tofu, make the earth go faster. So the witch doctors are in control of our grid, and what we should be having in our national grid is a debate about what makes electricity work, why it saved us, why it's so important, and instead we have these bizarre debates. And think about this. This is, well, you might think this is infrastructure that is the industrial electrical generation plant that keeps your, cooks your toast, keeps your tea warm, helps your air conditioner run, all those kinds of things. But instead, it is a global climate controller. It makes bad weather. Everything bad is caused by CO2. And they never discover anything good. Yeah, all those studies, isn't it kind of weird? All those studies, everything CO2 does is terrible. Nobody mentions that warm weather, that we're mammals and that warm weather saves 20 times as many people as it kills. The cold weather is the big killer. Even in Brisbane, in sunny, hot Brisbane, more people die in winter. It's something like a 1-to-6 ratio. The deaths in the cold snaps or in the cold in winter in Brisbane kills more people than the heat. So, you know, forget Twiggy and his lethal humidity. The actual big killer on Earth is, of course, the cold. So we're in this fantasy state where the government is saying we're going to shift to 82% renewables by 2030. We don't even have enough minerals on Earth to get to net zero. We need more lithium, copper, nickel, cobalt, you name it. The numbers on this, and I'll just dig a couple of numbers out. We are riding the express train to the renewable faraway tree. So aiming for 82% glorious renewables, and if we look at the nickel statistics, we are the years to produce nickel for the first generation is 400 years. That's at current nickel production. So we need 400 years of nickel production to get the first generation of our renewable energy things built. For copper, we need 200 years of current production, and the lithium at the moment, because we're kind of new at it, we need 9,900 years of lithium production at 2019 rates in order to have enough lithium to do the first generation. And then after that, we've cut all the wind turbines and the solar panels down. We start again with the second generation. The numbers, these people are not good with numbers. Just wonder, they haven't. And so even Chris Bowen says we need to install 22,000 solar panels a day and 40 wind turbines a month between now and 2030. We know it can't be done. They know it can't be done. They know we know it can't be done, and yet we're all still pretending it's going to happen. It's only 5 years away. It's really quite bizarre. And there's also, yes, the neodymium. So just to put a big perspective on this, for like 1 million years, humans lived in huts and hovels and caves and things, and then we graduated. This is the last 1,000 years, and you can see the coal coming in here. Shifted, this is the GDP, the economics of the situation. And if you look at this, you can see back here in the 1300s, people spent almost all of the economy collecting food and fodder and wood. Their days, their hours were spent just doing the most basic thing for survival. And then this magic happened and coal came in. And as coal came in, the time and the effort spent on food and fodder and wood vanished. Coal gave us the freedom to build planes, to discover how the world works, to get the periodic table invented, to have the time to do all these magical things. So right now we're in a transition, well, we're still in a transition to fossil fuel, but I think some people are in a transition to the medieval era, or worse, the dark ages. If we look at fossil fuel, and despite all the hype, this is solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, and biofuel here, this black stripe. And that's hydro, nuclear, and all this is fossil fuels. So clearly, most of the world, 80%, is still running on fossil fuels, despite all of the stories, despite the billions, the trillions of dollars spent on trying to convert our economy, fossil fuels still rules. So there's our magic 82% statistic. It just plucked out of the air. These people haven't actually looked at the numbers. 22,000 solar panels a day and 40 wind turbines, and we're not even close. I think one quarter last year, there was like 2 new wind farms added to they're all stalled. And I'll explain later why they're stalled, but the irony is thanks to pretty much solar panels. Everything is stalling on our grid. So this is the environmental vision of the True Greens. Convert and cover the country with high tension lines and wind turbines. Now this is a diagram of an old coal generator, just to show you how big these things are, because the way things have worked in the last 100 years is to get more efficient, more centralised with energy, and so we've created these enormous turbines. Now these turbines on the grid weigh between 200 and 600 tonnes. This is just the metal part that spins that weighs that much. And so we've got 600 tonnes, it's spinning in Australia at 50 hertz, it's spinning at 3,000 RPM to make 50 hertz cyclic electricity, the push and pull of those electrons in the wires. So 3,000 times a minute, something as big as a 500-ton object is spinning 3,000 times a minute. Now, that kind of infrastructure takes hours to run up to speed and hours to run down, but it's so efficient. It's so wonderfully good at what it does. And of course, we can clean the other pollutants out of those towers because we've centralised the power. But the Greens want us to decentralise the power. Solar panels on roofs, wind turbines all across the country. It can never be efficient. We end up with thousands of bits of infrastructure spread across the country, every one of them a failure point for a bad day, bad weather, bad storms, all that extreme weather that climate change is supposed to bring, and we're putting up all those towers. So there's enormous infrastructure here. We spent 2 generations paying them off and making them work, and we're just blowing them up now. So this graph, actually this is a laugh till you cry moment, this is kind of depressing. This is back in like the 1950s. We managed to get the cost down of electricity, and then we got a national grid together. Well, that kind of worked, but then Kevin Rudd got elected. And after Kevin Rudd got elected, we thought we'd bring in these intermittent random energy generators, Julia Gillard's carbon tax, and obviously I need to update this, but the news just continues on. The more renewables we have, it's a funny coincidence, the more expensive our electricity gets. Now, notice too, remember the 1970s with the oil crisis and the inflation? That was back here. The price of electricity kept falling. So electricity didn't have to get more expensive in the 1970s with inflation. The engineers were so good, they were making it cheaper, even while everything else was getting more expensive. And so this is where we're aiming for, yes, the Rolls-Royce of irrelevant $1.5 trillion machines, which is going to be chrome-plated and beautiful, but go nowhere and do nothing quickly. It's all quite the tragedy. And of course, the hidden costs are what is killing us, and we're not really having a debate about those hidden costs, which is what we need to do to advance things forwards, because the hidden costs are everywhere. They tell us wind and solar are cheap, and on a 5-minute basis there's some truth to that, but we've got to look at the whole system cost. And this is different countries here and the electricity cost. Now, the killer question that the Liberals need to start asking is to ask the Labor Party to name one country which has lots of wind and solar and cheap electricity. Just one. Name one country. And they can't name any country, because as countries get more wind and solar in the grid, they get more expensive electricity and the prices rise. So the less wind and solar you have, the cheaper your electricity is. I mean, it's just data. So they need to start asking that question, because it's a killer. Now, not only is there no country, there's not even an island running off wind and solar, which is cheaper than running off diesel. It's that bad, and I'll talk more about that later. But, you know, for example, Flinders Island, King Island in Australia, they run off diesel gens, well, they used to, and now we've added the miracle of solar and wind, and the electricity prices have stayed the same, and they're up to about 65% renewables, and it hasn't made anything cheaper. We've added all that infrastructure for no net benefit, apart from slightly less CO2 emissions, fertiliser beneficial to the world. It's also, of course, infected our prices for electricity. And so this is, you know, 20, 30 years ago, we had about $30 a megawatt hour was the baseline price. This was a drought in 2007 that pushed prices up. This was Julia Gillard's carbon tax. They closed Hazelwood, and look at the effect on prices when Hazelwood closed. And then, well, this was the COVID era and the Ukrainian-Russian war, and prices have not gone back down. They will never see these days again until we get rid of the infection of renewable energy. And this is a killer graph I'm going to put up on my website soon. This is the share of renewables. Remember, during this time, the Liberal government did nothing. Remember how it went nowhere? Look at our renewables growth during the Liberal era. So we're now at nearly 30% in terms of the total energy generated in Australia. That puts us somewhere around about 5th or 7th in the world in terms of percentage of electricity made from unreliable random generators. And you can see the effect on the electricity price index and the CPI, a shocking effect compared to the 1970s. So this is also one of the wonderful environmental benefits we're going to get, which is thousands of kilometres of interconnectors, supposedly by 2030 and 28,000 by 2050 of these wonderful things that the farmers hate. You can see, despite most of Australia getting free solar and wind, what we don't have in Australia are free interconnectors. See the empty space there? So you can't build a solar panel gig out in Tibooburra without putting in a high tension voltage line to collect the energy from it, and they cost a fortune. And here you can see the Perth grid. For those who don't know, stretches from Albany to Kalbarri up here and Kalgoorlie over there. So we are a small disconnected grid from the main grid, and the main grid here runs right up from Cairns to Tassie through the cable underwater and to Olympic Dam in the middle of South Australia. So something like 40,000 kilometres of high voltage lines and other lines in there, and all running the same 50 hertz frequency on the eastern states. So that means the same push-pull 50 times a second from Cairns to Hobart. It's a miracle. It's a miracle I haven't screwed that up yet. But the fact that it runs at all is amazing. Now over here we've got the Perth little grid, which is to about a tenth of the size of this big grid. 90% of Australia is here in terms of population. And then we've got all these microgrids, and I'll talk about a couple of them later, Onslow and Alice Springs. All these microgrids make the ideal test case. You know the idea? Why don't we do a small test case before we run the whole country? Well, we're running the whole country. We're doing the test case on the country first, not getting a town to run on renewables. We'll just do the nation. Think about it. I mean, you can't make this stuff up in terms of how crazy this is. And we'll talk about how bad those little test cases are. These are some of the dreams of the high voltage lines, which are universally unpopular with the locals in the area. All these high voltage lines cost billions, and the prices are going up and doubling pretty much all the time. This is, yes, a farmer's thoughts on the farmer's comment on getting those high voltage lines through their property. You know, they can't use crop dusters, firefighting equipment. These high voltage lines are known to increase the risk of fires. They're an eyesore, and anyway, yes, farmers very unimpressed with it and making their message seen from space if you've got the right satellite. The hidden costs of backup are a killer. Now this is just last month in Australia, about June the 13th I think, a big high pressure cell. They're not unusual. You look at our nation and spot where, because the wind is slow when there's a high pressure cell. Where would the wind turbines work in Australia on this day? And the answer is maybe they would have worked in the Antarctic territory. We don't have a cable down there. And, but nowhere on this day did wind turbines work. That's what we need to do. This is energy production. That's the energy we needed. This is the energy that wind power gave us. This is the rating our wind is supposed to, theoretically, the capacity, 11.5 gigawatts of wind turbines produced at one point in the day, 88 megawatts. So that's 11,500 megawatts of industrial capacity producing 88 megawatts of energy, about the same as 2 big diesel gens, for a cost of about $20 billion. So this tells you about the backup. How much backup do we need for an 11.5 gigawatt wind system? We need about 11.4 gigawatts of backup. It's that bad. It was so less than 1% working on that day last. When we look at the long term, how's our wind? This is how our wind generators their peak. There's actually a grey line up to 100% there. The grey line that you can't see on this graph is the total capacity installed. This is the best kind of performance of those wind turbines, but this is the worst performance. This is the worst day. So if you look at that little blue line on the bottom, despite spending $20 billion to build that many wind turbines, it hasn't actually improved the baseline minimum level. I mean, that's a scandal. We spent all that money, and yet the guaranteed amount of electricity out of our $20 billion worth of wind turbines is practically nothing. We have to back the whole thing up. That means you have to build 2 grids, 2 whole grids working, and they thought that would be cheaper. I mean, these people just can't do numbers. Now, the Tamar gas plants in Tasmania, they built it in 2009 for about $250 million, and it was their last fossil-fueled backup plant when they shut it down in 2015, and a few months later the BAS cable broke and they were screwed with so they restarted it and they ran it for a few more years, and then in 2019 after that they just kind of put it on standby, and they've cranked it up again last month with the wind drought we've had. So for the first time in 5 years the Tamar gas plant was run. Now think about the cost of having a $250 million piece of infrastructure sitting around for 5 years on standby, waiting for when it was needed. And the cost is estimated to be somewhere between 12 million and 24 million a year to have it sitting there. That's a backup cost. Now that cost is not a cost of the gas plant, it's a cost of the wind turbines and the solar panels and the other stuff, isn't it? Because we wouldn't need to have it on standby if we'd built a reliable plant instead of putting the wind and solar on. So I say these backup costs, they should be chucked in the label, put under the category of accounting that says this is a solar and wind cost. Because at the moment it's being charged to fossil fuels. Oh yes, batteries, what a joke. You know, the Labor Party seems to think you can just click them into existence. You can just command the discovery and the discovery shall happen. A 100 megawatt battery roughly is about 220 million Australian dollars. Its capacity is roughly 400 megawatt hours, just to make that obvious. In a city the size of Perth, it will run the city for about 12 minutes. $200 million and you get 12 minutes of backup. So yeah, batteries are great for your microsecond kind of filler-in gaps so that you don't crash the system, maybe, but it's obviously, there's no way they can afford to back up our large generators. Now, they have a plan though. You're going to pay for the backup. That's right, you're going to be forced to buy electric cars, and those electric cars are going to be plugged in. And they will rescue the grid. Every time the sun goes behind a cloud and the wind stops, your cars will save the grid from collapse, and you'll get to pay the bill and be called a hero. And you know how this works. The rich will be able to do what they want with their cars, but the poor, well, you know, you can save a few $100s on the purchase of your car if you sign a deal which says you'll plug it in every night at peak hour. And so the riffraff will end up funding the grid, and the rich will do whatever they damn well want. Probably buy fossil fuel cars. You know, the second-hand price of fossil fuel cars is going up and the second-hand price of EVs is going down. The free market speaks. It is a car crash out there. We can talk more about it if you're interested later, but around the world, the news for EVs is terrible. Now, complexity is something we don't talk about, but it is a cost. Every time you complexify things, you use brain power, energy, mental effort. Someone has to go around and get your smart meter. And by the way, in WA, just so you know, we're one of the only states where you are allowed to ask them to take the radio box out of your smart meter. So when they force you to install a smart meter, you can say, I don't want one, I don't want to be tracked, I don't want China following my house movements and figuring out when I'm home and when I'm not. And they will take your box out, but I don't know how long that will last, but at the moment, at least, you have that option if they force you to install a smart meter. And they will have to send someone out to do the meter reading. And this is the duck curve in California. We are headed there in Perth because we have so many solar panels. So the middle of the day when solar panels work, this is the duck curve. Each year, more and more solar panels are installed, and they are providing electricity instead of the base load. So this is the belly of the duck. Now this is dinner time, the head of the duck, and the tail of the duck is breakfast time. Breakfast has always been the biggest load in our grid. The dinner's always been the biggest load. Breakfast is the second biggest. Everyone's coming home from work, putting on their ovens and their toasters and cooktops and whatnot. So this is peak hour, which is 6 to 8, and solar's useless, obviously, and the wind may or may not be there. And so solar's here when we don't need it, in the middle of the day where energy use is lower. But it's eating through the profits of everything else on the grid. This is a Vandal thing. The solar glut at midday is destroying the market. And it's destroying the market for baseload reliable generators. And I'll explain a bit more about this later, but the solar is we've got such a glut of solar. Jeff Dimery, running Alinta, said that you can't build anything, even big solar now, you can't put another plant in because the prices have gone negative at lunchtime. And because there's negative prices, no one wants to be running at lunchtime because those negative market, think about what negative prices means for something. If something's a negative price, everyone says, oh, that sounds so great, it's bringing the price down. But a negative price means it's so toxic you have to pay someone to take it away. And that's how much we're valuing solar energy at the moment. It's a toxin on the grid, it's poisonous because there's too much and we have to figure out how to get rid of it. And that's why in small towns it's become a real issue. Too much solar is destroying the grid. And so much for this bizarre idea that it doesn't matter when the electricity arrives. We don't want random electricity, ladies and gentlemen. We want reliable electricity, and you can't get that from solar or wind. So at lunchtime, the solar panels are just chewing through the profits of these big, reliable generators. So no one wants to build a big, reliable generator. No one wants to fix their old coal plants, and no one wants to be running at lunchtime if they can avoid it. So, people are running home, looking at their phone. When the prices spike down, they have to cut off, get rid of their production. They've just started charging solar owners in Sydney for lunchtime production. It's a small charge, but it's the first sign of a free market at work. They should have been doing this for 10 years. Lots of people wouldn't have installed solar panels if they'd realised that half the cost of the solar panel was being paid for by other people on the grid. It was never economic. And now the solar panel owners are upset, not surprisingly, because they thought they were helping the nation. They thought it was free energy and they thought it made economic sense. But the truth was it was only the subsidies that ever made it possible. And now we've got this pox on the grid, all these solar panels generating electricity. You have to do something with electricity. You can't just kind of let it run amok. You have to deal with it. And so the energy being dumped in at lunchtime in Sydney, they're now saying, started just the 1st of July, they would do a small charge for solar owners, and they're encouraging them to buy a car that they can plug in and charge at lunchtime, like everybody's at home at lunchtime, not at work. Yeah, and so they're hoping that people will buy a Tesla Powerwall to absorb their solar panels and make that make sense so they can get the energy back. Again, it's all just fiddling with the market, pure Soviet Bureau kind of management of our electricity grid. And so I say to the disappointed solar owners who are out there, and to people thinking about putting it on, those sunshine days are over for solar in the sense that we have to deal with this. It hasn't been fair. The neighbours, the poor people who can't afford solar, are the ones who paid for half the installation of solar panels. They need their money back, really. So solar owners should be charged a little bit gradually to feed that back into the system and to discourage more solar panels. We don't need more. They're not helping. We don't need more energy at lunchtime. We need more energy at dinner time. So this glut of solar at lunchtime has pretty much stopped investment in the grid, both renewable investment and reliable investment. It's all come to a grinding halt, and that's part of the problem with this, 82% target by 2030. The solar glut at lunchtime, this is according to Jeff Dimery, who runs Alinta, that it is just not economic to install anything on the grid. And here's another demand management complexity we have. Back last October, Boral was saying that they were standing down or effectively putting on standby 5,500 workers in their concrete factories because they just couldn't afford the electricity bill when the prices spiked in the evening. So they would get 5,500 guys to sit around and twiddle their thumbs, watch cat videos on YouTube or something, instead of doing work because that was better economically for them than running the company and making concrete. You can't run a country like this. This doesn't make, that's demand management. Just trying to cope with the fact that we don't have enough energy on the grid at dinner time. This is another complexity coming. In Queensland, the government is already offering people a discount for their air conditioners. So the riffraff will say, I'll take that $200 discount on my air conditioner, or the $400 if it's a big one. I'll take that money, thank you. But the price is the government gets to reach into your home and turn off your air conditioner. Like the octopus that it is, it has a smart controller on the air conditioner to switch off their air conditioners. And they said, you won't even notice it? It'll hardly tell. We're just going to wind your air conditioner down on the like the hottest day of the year, just once or twice. Well, actually, it ended up being something like 6 or 8 times over summer that they did that to like 170,000 homes. It was a big deal. And here's the most sinister part of it. They said, you won't even notice, and they won't tell people when they're doing it. So it's a secret, just in case you do notice. They even send messages electronically to the people who installed the air conditioners, so that if you ring up the guy and say, hey, my air conditioner's not working, the guy who installed it will be able to say, no, it's doing just what it's supposed to do. How sinister is that? So they won't tell the owners of the air conditioners, but they'll tell the installers, so that they don't get thousands of calls from people saying my air conditioner's broken. So the rich won't need their $400 cash back. They'll take an air conditioner that works on the hottest days of the year, and the riffraff, well, you know, yes, you will, what was that saying? You will own nothing and be hot and bothered. Yeah, you thought you were going to be happy, but no, hot and bothered is how it works. So the government will effectively own your air conditioner. They're the ones who control it. You just think you do. So we'll see that pattern, and, well, yes, just an ode to the new green environmental nation that we're becoming. So the Greens have been completely captured by these big corporate forces. They're just effectively stooges for the renewables industry or for China, or no one talks about the total system cost. The Liberals need to start talking about the total system cost, because it's not about the half-hour cost, it's about the total cost on the system, which we talked about before going up. There's an experiment done in America, Stacey and Taylor, in about 2015, where they tied a gas plant that works just fine all of the time to a wind farm, and they said, as a whole package, let's look at the costs. And what they found was that the cost of the gas plant went up by $30 a megawatt hour when it was tied to the production of the wind farm. So in other words, running a gas plant up and down was $30 a megawatt hour more expensive than just running it flat and efficiently all the time. I mean, what a shock. Who could have seen that coming? So the craziness on this is that wind and solar make everything less efficient and more expensive. They are the pox on the grid. They are the vandals on the grid, destroying what was a beautifully engineered, intricate mechanism, and they're wrecking it. And we need to start saying that. And this $30 a megawatt hour cost, that has got to be added to the wind farm, not the gas plant. So when CSIRO does its gen costs, you can bet that they're not adding these costs to the wind farm, but it is a cost of the wind farm, not a cost of the gas plant. We are asking these plants to run inefficiently, like driving a car in the country, in the city instead of the country. The mileage is going to be worse. That effect is a renewables effect, not a fossil fuel effect. And this was the study. So there's the gas plant running all the time as it's meant to do at about 85% capacity, and there it is with the wind farm coming and going randomly. And we wonder why this is not as cheap. We built 1.8 times the infrastructure to get the exact same amount of electricity, and they reckon it's going to be cheap. Who are these people? And look, I'm sorry, I just have to throw in these shots here. This is just a turbine and some people working on it, and just imagine these things spinning at 3,000 RPM, and then think about screwing that up. This is to show you a month of production on the East Coast, just so you get the idea of how random things are. So this is the sun coming in every day and the big solar and the wind adding up to this effect. And this is what brown coal was doing 10 years ago. So this is only 10 years ago. That was the brown coal in Victoria running kind of like that. And this is where it's at now. Imagine the effect on those enormous machines of the stop, the start, the stop, the start. Brown coal can do this to some extent, not as well as gas can, but this is a nightmare. And here's the thing about the nuclear debate. Nuclear doesn't do even this kind of up and down. Nuclear is like antimatter to renewables because it wants to run flat tack for years and those renewables want to come and go. So the two of them make a terrible mix because you can't change your nuclear plants and make them go up and down to fit in with the renewables. So yeah, Peter Dutton has totally thrown kryptonite into the national debate because the more nuclear you put in, the less renewables you can afford to have on the grid. Not that he's suggesting a huge amount at the moment, but you can see why the Greens hate the idea of nuclear. It's not about the radioactivity, it's because it's going to hurt all of those companies and productions that want renewables to succeed. So the Vandals in the market. Now, I go on about this, but I feel like I'm the only one in Australia who does. This is a Victorian wholesale winning bids. It's like most states. This is the last quarter that we got numbers for, quarter one this year, and the prices and the different energy sources. This is brown coal, providing about 15% of the successful winning bids in Victoria. It provides far more than that in electricity. But in terms of setting the price, and the price was $8 a megawatt hour. Black coal was 72, gas was 104, and hydro was 83. So I thought I'd help the AEMO, who seem to have billions of dollars. This is the price of black coal, 72 in that quarter that it was setting, and gas and hydro. And look, no one ever seems to graph brown coal. The AEMO often leaves it off its graphs. But when we put brown coal in the mix, the whole conversation changes. We're not even discussing how incredibly bountifully cheap brown coal-fired electricity is. And here's the kicker. They've got like 200-metre thick veins of brown coal in Victoria in the Latrobe Valley, one of the largest kind of reserves in the world. They estimate it will last 1,000 years at 2016 production levels. We've got 1,000 years. Just imagine someone discovered an energy source in Australia, a tenth of the price of black coal and gas and hydro, and then the teenage girls talked us into not using it because it might create more storms in 100 years. So Peter Dutton, I agree he should be arguing for nuclear, but we are mad for not just running those brown coal generators and building more of them. Brown coal is free of the international market, unlike black coal. And when everyone around the world in the Ukrainian war started, everyone realised they needed coal and gas and oil, and the prices of those went up, and the prices of renewables, well, they went up too, but people weren't buying them. What we see with the brown coal is it didn't go up in price because you can't stick it on a ship and sell it overseas. And so our brown coal is our brown coal. Apparently brown coal bursts into flames spontaneously, sometimes on boats, which is just a small problem. So you can't ship it overseas. And that applies to us here in WA. The Indian group bought access to our coal down south, which is not brown, but not quite black either, and thought they could stick it on boats and send it to India, which desperately wants coal, and they couldn't. And so that was a big miscalculation. And so they're pretty much, they paid far too much. They're going bankrupt. And we're feeling the effects of that because they won't, due to their laws and whatnot, they're not dealing with that, and we are not getting cheap coal. And this is a really heavy graph here, but this is the brown coal price here. The brown, see that each quarter going back for like 10 years. So brown coal is cheapest every single quarter. There's nothing that beats it on the Australian East Coast grid. That black coal is there. You can see that went up with the war. Hydro also went up with the war, and gas and batteries, and they're all hideously expensive. And these strange anomalies down here, wind and solar, look at the negative pricing. Like, how does that work? That's just vandalising the free market. They can only do negative prices because of the subsidies. So because they earn subsidies, they can bid below zero, knowing that they will always be picked up in the bid stack. So they bid below zero, and we get these bizarre, surreal prices, which imply that they're, you know, toxic products that no one wants, but they say negative prices are a good thing. But you can see the effect. Look how big these negative prices are, and the effect on, say, Boral and others caught at the wrong time. Well, they're not producing electricity, sorry. For Boral, the problem is the peak pricing. But for AGL and Origin and Energex and all those other companies, they don't want to be on the grid when the negative prices hit because they have to pay for producing electricity. It's just mad. Yes, we are on a transition to a crash test dummy status. It's going to be biblical unless we stop. And yes, the other aspect of the global thing, this is in Germany and Ireland, I think. They're installing solar panels here because they're so cheap. They're putting them in as fences, garden fences. There's such a glut because China has bet so big on making solar panels. China now has twice the capacity of global demand for solar panels. Because once interest rates went up, the true cost of solar and everything else meant no one can afford the loans to install frivolous things like solar and wind. So the last year has been just a basket case for all the renewables industries. So China has made a big bet, and I think they're going to pay handsomely because they've made all this capacity the world turns out doesn't really want anymore now that money's got harder to borrow. So we're in a solar panel glut where China now has twice the capacity the world wants. Albanese has come out with his big, great plan for Australia, a future made in Australia, where we're going to compete with China, which already has twice the global capacity anybody needs for solar, and he's going to spend billions making us leaders in a race to nowhere, where we can build our own solar panels and compete with a market made by slaves in Xinjiang with no labour market kind of, you know, benefits or standards, and we're going to compete with that. That's the vision. It's nuts. So yes, and where is that feasibility study? Remember I said I was going to talk about a couple of small towns? Why can't we get solar and wind to work in little towns before we wreck the whole nation? So having a look at a couple of these places, in Onslow, where everyone here knows where Onslow is, like one of the sunniest places in the world, the ABC got excited a few years ago, as they do, and they got excited because Onslow had reached 100% renewable. Now you get such a lot of insight into what the real situation is by what they get excited about. Was it because Onslow was 100% renewable for a year? No. Was it renewable for a month? No. Was it renewable for a week? No. It was 100% renewable for 80 minutes. Yeah, it was a big deal. A whole hour and a half running on their solar panels, and the ABC put up a whole news story about it. You think about how tragic this is. It's like about 800 people living in Onslow, and what it took to get them renewable, and the craziness of this situation. So the sunniest place in the world, and an hour and a half of renewables is something that we should be thrilled about. And then if we look at Alice Springs, 25,000 people, it's like, you know, 1,000 kilometres from a big grid. So it's running off diesel gens effectively. Now, if you can't make that work in renewables and make electricity cheaper, where can you do it? Nowhere. And so in Alice Springs, you can see how far it is from the other grids, which are marked on that map further north, and it's got a duck curve. Oh boy, does it have a duck curve. And the duck curve's at the point where it's threatening the diesel gens. You've got to keep your diesel gens running so that when the cloud comes over, and remember, clouds roll over. Alice Springs had a blackout in 2019 because the clouds ran over and crashed the grid. So you've got to keep your diesel gens running in the background. So we're looking here at the duck curve in Alice Springs, and this is, I think, it's about 50% roughly. So you still want to keep this base load running, and then look at the ramp up. Everything's got to gear up for dinner time, and it's just crazy at the moment. But in Alice Springs, the ABC ran a story saying how excited they were that Alice Springs was going to lead the way to 50% mythical renewables, and was going to, but we're supposed to be going to 82% across the whole country. So the ABC was excited that one small town might get to half the national target by 2030. Like, that's how bad it is. And it's worse than that because right now, Alice Springs is running at how many percent renewable? Ladies and gentlemen, a quarter of the houses have solar on the roof and there's one solar grid and it scores 13% renewable. That's right, it's 87% fossil fueled in Alice Springs and they can't seem to get it higher than that, higher than 13%. And that tells you something about what it's like in Australia. South Australia runs at much higher renewable levels, but that's because it's got the safety cord, the extension cord to Victoria. So without that extension cord, the truth is a quarter of houses with a solar panel and you're at the point of wrecking your grid. International price comparisons, I apologise for how complicated this is, but to work out retail prices on electricity is just like a PhD project. So this is a complicated graph. Here we got United Kingdom and it's up at like 350 euros, Japan, EU, USA and China. Look how cheap that is because it's running off coal, of course, and nuclear. China will be the biggest nuclear power in the world by 2030 at current rate of expansion. It will overtake the US to be the largest nuclear force in the world by 2030. So here's Australia here next to the EU weighted 27. Sorry, this is so complicated. Here's the EU. So this is where we're at along this line here. And we have now gone, I calculate, up to about there. Not as expensive as the UK, but more expensive than most of the EU. So look at this graph. So there's us, and for some reason it all got too hard for the EU for us after that. They just gave up. We had so many price rises, like 20% and 20%. So all the other nations in the world with less renewables than us, and China. Now we used to be here, they estimate in 2008, I think, at about $100 a euro thing retail. China was at the bottom of the last page. China's now below 100, like at 80. So China since then has gone down by 20%. We've gone and doubled since then. So no wonder we can't compete with China on anything. Our electricity's gone up in price while theirs has gone down. I just want to show you, you know, I said that South Australia could afford to be a renewable experiment because it has the extension cord through the Hayward interconnector to the power stations down here in Victoria. But ponder in Europe, those countries that have more renewables than us, there's like 5 or 6, Greece, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and they all have expensive electricity. But they also have interconnectors. So that's the European interconnector network. There's 400 million people on that network. There's a synchronous network there that runs for almost all of Europe and is also now connected to North Africa, I think. These states are on their own, I think they are, and the UK has its own frequency. It's just connected through these DC cables under the water. But look at how many cables there are through the oceans. And of course, all the cables in Australia are marked on this graph. The ones connecting us to other countries, you know, like as if Papua New Guinea is going to rescue our grid. We have no interconnector. We have no extension cord to rescue us. That's the same of Perth. There's no cord across the country here. So when we wreck our grid here, I thought that kind of protected us, the fact that we don't have an extension cord. But we're doing it anyway. We've installed more solar than just about anyone. And as Mark Chatfield says, that gas pipe is full. We've got cheap gas coming from the Northwest Shelf, which is great, but it's full. At peak time, we can't pump more gas down it than we're already pumping. So we're going to hit the wall in a bad way sometime in a couple of years. Yes, the transition to medieval feudalism is really what we're talking about here, where the government owns everything. And so the nuclear energy debate, and I'm sorry for people who are saying, this slide always sticks. So you probably know Australia has the most uranium in the world, but do you know how much? We have more uranium, just probably because we're better miners, better explorers, whatever. We found it, yet we're not using it. So these are all the countries with nuclear plants around the world, something like 430 working nuclear plants around the world, and we're discussing whether they're feasible, whether they're possible. You know, Armenia has nuclear plants, Czechoslovakia has nuclear plants, and Argentina, and we're wondering if we can possibly make one work. Now, when the Labor Party has advanced from its attack a month ago, where they've moved on from three-eyed lizards, and they're now talking about the problems with nuclear being too expensive, too slow, and that it uses fresh water in a country that has droughts. And that's going to be their three main arguments. And the answer to that is France, and lastly, that you can run nuclear plants off seawater. And I don't think we're going to run out of that. So if we look at France, in 1972, when the oil crisis hit, the president went, we need a major plan, we're going to build lots of nukes. And they built 56 nuclear plants in the next 15 years. So we're talking nearly 50 years ago, they built 56 nuclear plants, and at that point, their population was about twice ours. So I reckon pro rata, that's about 28 nuclear plants we should be aiming for now. Seems kind of fair. Most of those nuclear plants took 5 to 7 years to build. Some of them, I think, are still working. The oldest nuclear plant in the world is one in Switzerland that started in 1969. So more than 50 years it's been running. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about a zero emissions, and they say they're worried about CO2. I mean, there's the big lie, isn't it? It's a 50-year-old safe technology that's been in use for decades, and it could solve the climate crisis, and they don't want to know. Because we don't want to solve the crisis, do we? Because CO2 isn't really the problem. So, I mean, it tells you everything you need to know about the Greens, Labor, all the rest of it. It's got nothing to do with CO2, and it never did. It's not about the environment. They've just been captured by some corporate banker, whatever, President Z, who knows force. There are lots of forces that benefit from us sabotaging our electricity, everyone except us. And so, you know, just look at France, and they built all these reactors, and those reactors are still working. And then when they talk about the freshwater problem, there's nuclear plants that run off seawater and convert it. They're desalination plants. They use the heat from the nuclear plant to generate fresh water. Like, do you think that could work in Australia? So I think the Soviets built one of those. They planned it and started in 1964. So if we perhaps change our thinking, we might catch up with the Soviet Union 55 years ago. South Africa still runs one that produces fresh water from the nuclear plant as a byproduct. So, you know, I guess if the Liberals want to put their nuclear plants where the old coal ones are, they might not be able to get seawater easily, but we do have coastline, and we do have major cables running up and down that coastline. So it's not impossible that we could do that, and that would solve the freshwater thing. By the way, coal plants need fresh water, and it does matter. We did see a price rise on our electricity grid in 2007 when there was a drought because the coal plants of Queensland were running out of water. And water affects our hydro. Sometimes you have too much, sometimes you have too little. Believe it or not, too little we all understand. Too much is also a problem. The Hume Dam has to limit its outflows when the bottom dam is full. It can't just dump water down there because it'll flood out the farms on the bottom. So in years where we get too much water, and remember Australia is the land of flooding, rains and droughts, too much water stops our hydro from working as well. So just weather dependent, just kind of madness. Ladies and gentlemen, I probably better stop there, and although I could go on and on, do you want me to talk about cars? But thanks for listening today, and for being here. And any questions you want to have, got a bit of time for questions now. So yes, we can do that, and watch out, they are coming for your cars. They want them. Thank you.